today, if I were just going to give a title to the 8th chapter of 2 Samuel, it would simply be this: the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. He just changed everything. 14 years ago, it was actually February 21st, 2012. I had an opportunity to travel with 6 other people from Canby, from the Canby Christian Church to Uganda. It was the second time that I had been on a missions trip there. It's a lot of flying to get to Uganda. I know there's a couple people in the room who've been there, and it's about 23 hours, to fly from Portland to Houston and Houston to London and then London to Entebbe down in Central Africa. And then once you arrive, you are in a 10-hour time difference. So that kind of changes how you feel. You get there and it's like, oh, it's really late at night. It's time to go to bed. Well, it feels like I just had lunch. And you are just in a state of not being able to rest like you would want to. Well, we had gotten there, and February 21st was actually our 6th day there. Every single day had been filled with activity, with things that just were exhausting. And we came to this Tuesday, and we got up early in the morning. We had been staying at a hotel in a city called Mubembe, and we then would travel for about half an hour to get to a little village called Kachungwa. Kachungwa was not even on the map. If you get a map of Uganda, you won't find it anywhere. But you just find Mubembe and you go, oh yeah, so it must be about there. And as we got to Kachungwa, we were greeted by hundreds of children. There are about 600 kids that are in their school. We got to be with them. We spent some time that morning team teaching and being with the kids, let them ask lots of questions about what it's like to live in the United States. They would ask us questions that I didn't quite know how to answer, like, what kind of crop do you grow? And I don't really. Well, I have an apple tree. And there were just questions that they had assumed that things were much like their home, but things were really different there. And after we had had time with the kids, we had an opportunity to walk, because that's what everybody did, and walk out into the village area and deliver mosquito nets and some food. Mosquito nets because the most difficult thing most families face is malaria. And there were kids who had had malaria multiple times, and we even experienced one day losing a young girl when we were working with the medical team. It just broke our hearts. And after a couple of hours of doing that, we had meetings with some other people, sponsored kids, and then we had this assignment that had kind of been waiting for us. From 3:30 until 5 that day, we were to go to a public high school. And we were going to go, a couple members of our team were going to be sharing their testimony. Some were going to be sharing some special music. I was going to be sharing a message and just explaining the gospel. And one of our host leaders was going to be sharing his testimony. And we were excited for that. It was kind of like the big event of the day. But it just seemed like time after time after time, we ran into interruptions. And by the time we got on the road, we were just like, oh, we're going to even be able to get there on time. It was February, but it was hot. Uganda's on the equator, and it was 86 degrees in the middle of February. And we were hot, it was dusty, we were tired, and we're like, are we going to even be able to do this? We finally got to the school. It was 4:45. We're like, oh, there's only 15 minutes left of the time we're supposed to be there. And the headmaster of the school invited our group in. And he said, I want you to come into my office. And so we came and we gathered, and he looked at us and he did something that we wouldn't expect in our public schools here. He said, I want you to tell them about Jesus. We can do that. We prayed. We prayed for him. We prayed for the students. And he said, I know that we're kind of getting a late start. And some of these kids have to walk like 10 kilometers, which is about 6 miles to get home. So we can't stay too late. But maybe we can do like 40 minutes or so. And so we went out. And then, of course, there was another kind of disruption in that the sound system wasn't working right for a while, and they were messing with that. And eventually it came down to where, okay, you have about 15 to 20 minutes. And so we had to change our plans. And the two that were going to give their testimony, we said, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to do one special song, and then I'm going to share the gospel. And then our host was going to share his testimony. And so we did that. There were about 400 to 500 students seated on the ground in their school uniforms, and they're very polite, and they listened intently to all the things that were said. And at the conclusion of our time, our host just said, we want to give you an opportunity to pray with us. And so they had us divided up, and we each had someone with us who could be an interpreter if that was needed. And we just invited them to come and pray with us. And we had them stand, and they kind of looked at us, and we looked at them. And my thought initially was, I don't think anybody's going to move. And we just kind of stared, just because like I'm staring at you and you're staring at me. It's like, is anybody going to move? And then all of a sudden, one student kind of came from the right and walked up to one of our group. And then there were a couple more. And then it was like an invisible gate opened up, and we were flooded with kids who came, surrounded us, probably a dozen to 15 around each one of us, tears streaming down their face. And we prayed for each one individually as they said, I want to receive Jesus. I want to follow him. One of the most powerful moments, really, in my life. Later that evening, we dismissed everybody. We got on our bus. We went back to our hotel. And once we got there, we kind of gathered in the hallway, and we looked at each other, and we said, what just happened? We were so tired. We were ready to cancel everything. It was late. It wasn't going to work. It wasn't going as the plan had been set out. And yet, that was amazing what God did. I remember one of the things they told us just as we got on the bus. They said there were 153 kids gave their life to Jesus. That made me think of a Bible passage. And I was like, with our group, I said, I think it's in the Gospel of John, and it is. In John, the last chapter, talks about when Jesus, after he had risen from the dead, it was his third time to appear before the disciples. They had gone fishing. Peter said, hey, I want to go fishing. They joined him. They'd fished all night, hadn't caught anything. Jesus shows up on the shore. He says, how's it going? Bad, we haven't caught anything. Well, throw your nets on the right side. Okay. And suddenly, their nets were full of fish. It's interesting to me that number kind of stuck in my head, because once they got to shore, they counted all the fish. There were 153 large fish. Isaac Williams, who was one of the young people on our trip, goes, I wonder if God put that in the Bible for today? And I'm like, probably not. But it was an amazing thing that we had experienced. A couple years later, I actually had a person who had been to Israel who, when he had gone on a tour, he got to be in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. And he said that their guide, who was the tour guide, recalled that story. And he said, to the people who live here, there's a significance to that number. To them, it means God is here. I'm not a person that studies a lot of numerology, but I couldn't argue with that. He showed up and provided a victory that none of us expected. He did something that was beyond all of our wildest imaginations. Well, today, in chapter 8 of 2 Samuel, God shows up over and over and over to show victory wherever David went. I'd remind you, last week Tim was talking about David when in chapter 7, David is thinking, and he speaks to Nathan the prophet, and he says, I want to build a house for God. I'm living in a cedar palace, and the Ark of the Covenant's in a tent. We need to build a place for God to dwell among us. Nathan said, yeah, it's kind of a good idea. But then God speaks to Nathan, remember? And he said, David, that's not your role. Someone in your family will do that. But he says in 2 Samuel 7, I have been with you wherever you have gone. And I've cut off all of your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And that was God's promise to David. It's interesting, if you go on into the chapter 7 a little deeper, you see a prayer. And David says, who am I, sovereign Lord? And what is my family that you have brought me this far? And I just got to thinking about what that was like for him. David was a teenager when Samuel came to his family and anointed him to become the next king. Scholars don't know exactly how old he was, but they imagine somewhere between 15 and 18 years old. It's kind of a heavy load when you've been a shepherd, taking care of the sheep, to maybe become the king of a nation. And it didn't happen immediately. In fact, David was about 30 years old when he finally became king. Have you ever had to wait for something for like 15 years? That's a long time. There are things, some of us, maybe you've gone to school and graduate school and you had to, for whatever profession that maybe you've worked in, and it just seemed like it took forever to get there. Well, this whole experience for David must have been amazing. I was just thinking, what would he reminisce about? I mean, he can remember how God delivered him from the bear when it attacked his flock. He delivered him from the lion when it attacked his flock. It instilled within him this confidence that God protected him and would be with him wherever he went. And so when he showed up on the front lines that day, when Goliath stood before the armies of Israel and mocked God and mocked the armies of Israel, he was like, why are you letting this happen? Someone going to go fight this guy? What's going on here? And he eventually went to King Saul and said, I'll fight him, because he knew that it wouldn't be him, it would be God. God would be the one who showed up. He knew that because he had shown up every other time in his life. And so he went out, and God was with him, and he defeated Goliath. and God provided an incredible victory. But then his mind probably wandered to, yeah, but then I'm playing music for King Saul, and he throws a spear at me. You ever have things going one way, and you feel like everything's good, and then all of a sudden someone attacks, or something happens. Something goes completely wrong, and it didn't go the way you expected it to. And for a period of 10 to 12 years, David is on the run, hiding out, trying to escape the wrath of King Saul. In the back of his mind, he's like, God said, I'm going to be the next king. This is going to be hard to get to. And Saul was after him. I'm sure you remember the time when he was in the cave, when Saul came in by himself, and David's with his men in the back of the cave, and his men are like, now's your chance. Go kill him. Now you can take over. And David is like, no, God's in control. This is what God's going to do. He went up and he cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He waited till he got out, and then he called out to him. He was not going to lay a hand on God's anointed. He knew God had a plan, and he wasn't going to try and take it over. I don't know if we ever do that. You ever do that? God's got a plan, and you try to take it over. And he was going to let God follow through on what he was going to do. Same thing happened again later. After Saul the first time said, yeah, you're right. What am I doing? You're honorable and I'm not. Again, Saul's after him. And David, with one of his men, sneak into Saul's camp. Saul's bodyguards are asleep. Saul's asleep. The man who's with David says, let me just run him through with a spear right now. And David says, no, we're not going to lay a hand on God's anointed. If he dies in battle or something happens, that's for God to do. Not me, not you. So they took Saul's spear, they took his jug of water, got out of the camp, called out from the hillside, and confronted Saul once again. And Saul finally dealt with the shame in his own life, and he said, you're righteous and I'm not. And he left. I'm sure all of these memories are flooding David as he thought about what God had said to him through Nathan the prophet. Because then eventually Saul died in battle, and David was the king. At first, just in Judah for a period of about 7 years, and now he would be the king of a united Israel, because God was providing for that to happen. And David would be king for a total of 40 years. And Israel knew peace through most of that time. There would be battles, but God always provided victory. Chapter 8 is a summary of who they had conflict with. And it's a summary of how God kept his promises to David. And so as we look at this, I want you to see those things. Chapter 8, if you're one of those people who reads through the Bible every year, and I hope you do, when you come to chapter 8 of 2 Samuel, this is one where probably you could read through. It's not very long. It's like 18 verses. And you read through it, and then you reach over and you put a check mark. Okay, I read that. And you don't remember much about it because not much stands out to you probably unless you really do a deep dive into what happened here. It's just like, yeah, they fought battles. Okay, they're always fighting battles, right? They're always fighting the Philistines and the Moabites and all those guys. And we don't pay much attention to what the message is. And the message is this, that God promised, I'm going to protect you now. I'm going to fight your battles. You're going to move forward, and you're going to experience the promise that I made in the beginning to you. So in verse 1 of chapter 8, it says, in the course of time, David defeated the Philistines, and he subdued them. And he took Metheg-Ammah from the control of the Philistines. And so I would go, oh, time out. Wait a minute. Okay, there was a time, remember, when, of course, David was with Israel, and he defeated Goliath, and they defeated the Philistines. But when David was on the run, where did he go hide out? With the Philistines. They allowed him to come and live with them. And he spent time there. He even offered to go and fight against Israel and against the army of Israel. But they didn't really trust him to do that. Now that he's king, the Philistines decide, oh, you're our enemy again. And they came to do battle. But God gave them victory on every side, at every point. And it says they took over Metheg-Ammah. Now, if you look on your Bible maps, you're going, where's that? I don't see that listed anywhere. And basically what it was the major city of the Philistines. It was probably the city of Gath. And he took over the most powerful population of all of the Philistines and had control over them. David also defeated the Moabites. And you may ask, who were the Moabites? Remember Lot? After God had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot's wife had looked back, we're told that she became a pillar of salt. Then there was kind of the ugly story of Lot's daughters who had lost both their fiancés at Sodom and Gomorrah. They decided to get their father drunk and sleep with him. The oldest daughter had a son who she named Moab. And the Moabites were the descendants from that relationship. The youngest daughter had a son named Ammon, and the Ammonites are the descendants from that daughter. David defeated them. And this is a part where, I read this and I'm like, oh man, it's hard for me to imagine. He says he made them lie down on the ground, and he measured them off with a length of cord. And every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. And so the Moabites became subject to David, and they brought him tribute. It's hard for us to imagine what life was like in the warfare that took place in those days. When people fought, they weren't sending missiles or shooting from a long range. It was face to face. It was with a sword. It was with clubs. It was with a spear. There were some who were archers who would fire arrows, but warfare was really very personal, and it was very graphic. And I can't imagine how the warriors felt when they finally were at a place of peace and having all the memories of fighting and killing and the bloodshed and the things that went on. This practice, this thing that David did in killing 2 out of every 3 of the Moabite soldiers, sounds really horrible, but it was really commonplace in their day and what they lived with. Jewish tradition also says that when David was running from Saul, he moved his parents for fear that Saul was going to hunt them down, and moved them to a region where the Moabites lived. and entrusted his parents into their care. And Jewish tradition says the Moabites killed his parents. I don't know if revenge was a part of this or whether it was just warfare. We look at that and we go, oh man, that's horrible. But once again, God helped David to defeat one of their main enemies. It was the Moabites, remember, who, when Israel had left Egypt and God had told them to go into the promised land. Remember Balaam, the guy with the talking donkey? Yeah, he was called by the Moabite king to curse Israel, and he couldn't do it. He said, that's not what God is telling me to do, and he blessed them. And so he called them again to a different place. He said, I want you to curse Israel. And he wouldn't do it because that's not what God told him to do. It was the Moabites who refused to let them cross their land. Moreover, David defeated Hadadezer. I love it when Tim has a hard time pronouncing names because I just go, yeah, me too, buddy. So some of these names are hard. Hadadezer, the son of Rehab, king of Zobah. And when he went to restore, when he went to restore the monument at the Euphrates River, David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses, which, if you're an animal lover, you're like, oh man. But this was a military thing because there was a huge advantage to those who rode horses and to those who had the chariots. And this changed the outcome of the warfare between the two nations when this was done. This passage also tells us something about expanding to the Euphrates River. When Joshua was given the role after Moses died to take the nation of Israel into the promised land, they were able to achieve victory and to get almost all of it, but not quite everything that God had promised Abraham. There was still this part near the Euphrates River. Well, for the first time in the history of Israel, under King David, they occupied all of the promised land. That hadn't happened before, but after this victory, it did. When the Armenians of Damascus, and maybe your translation says Syrians, they're one and the same, came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Armenian kingdom of Damascus, and the Armenians became subject to him, and they brought tribute, which is another word for they paid taxes to him from that point forward. When they were defeated, they were taxed, and they were subject, and they were controlled by the leadership of Israel. And the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer, brought them to Jerusalem. From Teba and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tou, the king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and to congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. And Joram brought with him articles of silver and of gold and bronze. It was, thank you. This was our biggest enemy. They attacked us over and over again, and we've been in conflict with them. And now that's over because you have defeated them. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord. And this is something that I want you to see. David did not go, oh, I think I'll build myself a new throne. He didn't say, I'm going to keep all of this money. I'm going to use this for me. Over and over again, David took whatever came his direction and he dedicated it to God because he knew that God was the one who was providing for them. God was the one giving them victory. God was the one to be worshiped. If he wasn't going to be able to build a temple and a place for God to live in, he was going to store all of these things up for the person who eventually Solomon, his son, would be able to use these resources. He dedicated these to the Lord as he had done with the silver and gold from all of the nations that he had subdued. Edom and Moab, the Ammonites and the Philistines and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rabbath, king of Zobah. And David became famous, just like God promised in chapter 7. I'm going to make you famous. He did. I would venture to say that there's a large number of people, even alive today, who know about David and Goliath, who've heard his name. God did make him famous. He was not famous just for that. He's kind of in the middle between Abraham and Jesus. It was through his line that Jesus eventually would be born. He became famous after striking down 18,000 of the Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all of the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. And then the chapter concludes talking about the way David ran government, which is really the opposite of how Saul did things. Saul basically kind of had one or two people that he talked to, but he decided everything. David was organized. It says David reigned over all of Israel, doing what was just and right for all of his people. Whoa. I don't know that that's always been the case of kings in that day, but he cared about everyone. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder, which meant he was the person who took care of all important documents and records and about conflict in the past, and the scripture is written down from God. He kept everything in order. He was the one who you would go to if you needed to find out about important events in the past. The other day, Chris and I needed to get a copy of the deed for our house. And, so we had to go to the county, and there were people who have on record our copies of our deed, and we were able to get that. Well, this is kind of like what he did. He had everything really well organized so that there was no question about which property owned to which group of people and who did this and who did that. Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. They were from the line of Aaron. They were designated to be priests and leaders within their festivals and religious ceremonies as they worship God. Sariah was the secretary. Sariah, as secretary, took care of all of the correspondence, but he was also the person who took care of the treasury. When people paid taxes, when people brought gifts and tributes, he was the person who kept record of all of these things. He was the one who made sure that monies were used to help take care of people. That's why people thought that David was fair and just, because he took care of them. He wasn't just about himself. Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. I love Benaniah. Years ago, I read a book about him called In a Pit with a Lion on a Snowy Day. Benaniah was one of David's mighty men. He would become the person who would be the bodyguard of King David. He was his most trusted of his mighty men. Benaniah would also become the leader of the army under King Solomon. He was a warrior. He was a person who was amazing in the eyes of all of his people. And he served King David. And then David's sons were, now in this translation it says they were priests. Well, they weren't from the priests like from the line of Aaron. They actually were royal advisors. Your translation may say royal advisors, and that's actually a better translation. The Hebrew word can be translated either way, but what they really were advisors, and they were military men and advisors in that way. So that's chapter 8. And it'd be easy to look at chapter 8 and you read through that and you go, oh, wow. But it tells us a lot about David. David was a person of humility. David was a person who had a heart after God, and he wanted to do what was right, not just for himself and his family, but for all of Israel. He trusted God to lead the way and for God to bring victory. When we bring this back to the gospel, we see that David's victories, his reign of justice, and his established kingdom could be seen as a shadow or what we call a type of a greater everlasting kingdom of Jesus. A kingdom where God always provides victory, where God leads the way. In Matthew 1:23, we read, "Behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. David won battles because God was with him. Jesus wins the ultimate battle in victory over sin and death for us because he is the Lord with us. That victory started with his death, burial, and resurrection. And it is finished. Ultimately, it's fulfilled when Jesus returns in glory. I remember a year or so ago, I had the opportunity to preach about heaven here. And one of my favorite passages from Revelation is Revelation 21, 1 through 4. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. The sea was no more. I saw the Holy One, or saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." I look forward to that, and not just wishfully, knowing God always keeps his promises. Just like he kept his promises to David, he has kept keeping his promise to you and me through his son, Jesus. When we give our lives to him, when we believe on him, we confess his name, when we become people who change our thinking and turn our back on an old way of living and we live for him in obedience, and we follow him, God will allow each of us to see this incredible promise fulfilled. Wow. That is amazing. The Lord gives victory wherever David went. The Lord gives victory to all of those who are in Christ. As I was reading the other day, I wasn't planning to use this in my message, and I was like, whoa. In Psalm 78, and I don't think we have this up here, but Psalm 78, Asaph, who is one of the psalmists, at the end of his psalm writes this: He, being God, chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens. From tending sheep, he brought him to be the shepherd of his people, Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart and skillful hands. He led them. I mean, David not only was famous, but he was admired. He was a person that all of his subjects looked at and said, he is such an incredible leader and king for us, and we love him. So real quickly, got a couple other takeaways. Always remember that victory comes from the Lord. When we align our actions with God's will, he guides us to victory in our own battles, whether they're personal, whether they're spiritual, or whether they're shared. There's importance in acting justly and righteously. We honor God and we create a community that mirrors his kingdom when that's how we live. There's power in humility. I love it when David prays and he says, who am I that you bring me and my family this far? He was amazed at what God would do. Chris and I have lived in this community, 48 years now. And one person, I hear the word humility, and one person that always pops into my head instantly with the word humility was Frank Cutsforth. Maybe you agree with me. What an incredible man. Generous, humble, and a person who loved the Lord. God calls us to be people like that. There's a role of leadership that is so important. When we are godly people, we can inspire and guide others towards a common goal rooted in faith. There's a blessing that comes with generosity. David didn't keep things for himself or store up wealth that came his direction, even as gifts from other kings. Instead, he dedicated it to the Lord. He trusted that God's provision would be a way to bless other people as he had been blessed. Wow. That's an attitude that we need to have. When Chris and I first moved here 48 years ago, we were 22. We were just starting working at Canby Christian Church, and we were pretty much broke. And there was a lady in our community. Her name was Eva Herman. I don't know if any of you would know Eva, because this would go way back. But she, her husband, I believed, was one of the, for a while, was the owner of Canby Builder Supply. Eva's husband had died years before, and she had a condo on the golf course. And she also had a place in Arizona that she would go. And so she heard that we were trying to find a place to stay, and she went to Jay Hoffman, our pastor, and said, hey, they could stay at my condo for the next 6 months while they kind of save up money and get things together. And it was this incredible, generous offer. She said, the only conditions are, I need you to start my Cadillac up once a week and make sure that my golf cart still runs. And we're like, I guess we could do that. And it was this amazing, generous offer that she gave to us. She was this very petite little lady. I remember walking into the condo the first time, and there were paintings on the wall, and the top of the paintings were about right here. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's really nice. And she was just the sweetest person. And yet she had this generous heart. Years later, when she passed, she left this incredible gift to the church, which paid off the education building that had been built 12 years earlier. It was like, wow. And not just to the Canby Christian Church, but to other places. She left generous gifts. Generosity goes a long, long ways. One last thing. There's this legacy of a godly life. David's life and reign left a lasting legacy that pointed to God's faithfulness and his power. Our lives, too, can be a legacy. When we honor God, that inspires other people. By living according to his word, we can impact future generations and glorify God in all that we do. And God will grow the kingdom in amazing ways. Even when you least expect it, he is at work, and he will accomplish everything that he's promised.